Thank you, Mike, as always. Today, I'm delighted to host His Excellency Stavros Lambrinidis, the Ambassador of the European Union to the U.S., about U.S. and EU political and economic challenges. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
What guest could be more timely to have with us as we have a new monarch and prime minister in the UK, the continuing pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and rising inflation, and probably a recession in Europe and worldwide. Now, we're not going to be pessimistic, but we certainly have some challenges ahead of us. The ambassador brings two unique perspectives. First, his leadership in the EU and in a member country, as well as a time of service and economic trials, the financial crisis of 2007 and 8, and the subsequent Greek sovereign debt crisis. He's been the ambassador to the US since March 1, 2019. Earlier, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, Foreign Affairs Minister of Greece, Vice President of the European Parliament, and to make us proud, a political science graduate from Amherst and Yale Law School. I'm also delighted that you're the sixth ambassadors who's generously agreed to do a webinar with us, most recently Ambassador Etienne of France when they held the EU presidency, and earlier the ambassadors of Canada and Mexico to discuss free trade, South Africa, and Jordan. Mr. Ambassador, would you like to say a few words, or shall we go right to it?
Go right to it.
We're going right to it. Okay, the EU. What are the three things you want Americans to know about the EU that they probably don't know?
Only three.
Well,
okay.
No,
it's
three biggie.
It's a very good question, and I think it's one that every EU ambassador faces in this country, frankly, especially when administrations change. You almost have to start from the beginning sometimes, explaining the EU. But I think the first thing I would say, and I would remind anyone, is that is how we were created. This is the biggest peace process, peace project in history. Many people know us now as a huge economic superpower, but the fact of the matter is, we were created after the Second World War, after Europeans were killing Europeans, after blood was flowing in the streets of Europe, in our own hands, after what is arguably the biggest human rights violation in the world, the Holocaust, was committed in European hands. And we decided then that we would never, ever allow ourselves or anyone else in the world in our power to have the desire or the means in their hands to perpetrate similar atrocities. And we came out of the bloodiest war in recent history, and in 75 years, we've built what is arguably the most peaceful, the most prosperous region in the world, open region in the world that you find in history. We are not, therefore, simply a money union. We are a values union. And those who don't understand the political glue that keeps the EU together very often focus on some economic elements of it and assume, and I've seen this through every crisis that we've been through in the past few years, you mentioned the financial crisis, that at some point the EU will have to collapse. What they also don't understand is that we are, of course, not a federal state like the United States. We are more a confederation, but we're a confederation of independents, 27 independent countries that, just like the US, operate under a federalism system concept. Our countries have decided to cede voluntarily sovereignty on a number of major issues to the European government, to the European Commission, to Brussels, of course, with member states always and their leaders directing this course. They've decided to keep some elements to themselves and other elements are joint. This is entirely like the US system works, but it's also why the federal government in Europe, the European Union, is not a cosmetic exercise. It is a real powerful force. Because we came out of crisis, we know how to deal with crises. And one of the things that you see just in the past few years is how remarkable it's been that the EU has grown stronger, not weaker, with every crisis. In the financial crisis, many people predicted, I was a foreign minister at the time, they were asking me all the time, they didn't care about foreign policy, honestly, they wanted to ask me about the economics. So when is Greece going to leave the European Union? When is the euro going to collapse? And I told everyone, if you want to lose your money, just bet it on those predictions, because it's not going to happen. And of course, it didn't. But it took us a few years to find lasting solutions. Then the COVID crisis hit, a major crisis in which, in fact, health is one of those competences that member states had kept just for themselves. And it only took us a few months to be able to hit a stride as Europeans to procure together the PPE and everything else, instead of having each member state fighting with each other out in the open market, to use, in other words, our collective power. And we also set up at that time a major fund, for the first time using the EU's collective economic strength to borrow in the markets to support our countries as we move now to the transition to an even stronger economy. And finally, the Russian crisis came. I don't need to tell you why, given our history, this is existential. This is the face of evil reincarnated in our continent. But frankly, for our American viewers, there's no safe distance when an autocrat sitting on nuclear weapons is bent on, destroying the international legal order and destroying peace, democracy, and security around the world. There's no safe distance for Americans as well. So this is the first point I would like to say. The second point that people may not know is what we are now. And now we are the second biggest open economy in the world after the United States. As I said, the biggest free economy or open market, the European Union, 450 million, citizens and consumers. The biggest, Americans and Europeans together, artery of the world economy, and the biggest creators of prosperity, jobs, and hope in our respective shores, outside of whatever it is that we do individually, independently for our own economies. About 15 million jobs every day today are being created across the Atlantic because we are the biggest investors, we Europeans here in the United States, by far, compared to anyone else in every single one of the 50 US states, creating those jobs. And because Americans equally are creating millions of jobs back in Europe, and US companies are making more profits in Europe than they make collectively in the rest of the world. This is not in spite of the European Union, it is because of it. We are not just the biggest peace project in the world, we are, and I know this may sound counterintuitive to some of our listeners, the biggest deregulation experiment in the world. The European Union took the laws and regulations of 27 independent countries and put them aside. And in their place, it replaced them with one common set of rules and regulations that allowed us to knock down borders among our 27 countries and to create this huge market that allows now any US company to set up shop in any corner of Europe and to be able then to trade, invest with the 450 million consumers of Europe without the singlest barrier, but also allows American companies in Europe to take advantage of a huge world economic footprint and trade footprint. We have free trade agreements with about 70 countries in the world. American companies producing in Europe can use those opportunities as well to be able to export around the world. So that's the second thing I would say, maybe many Americans don't know. The third thing I would say, and the last thing, is about the future. We'll talk, I hope, more, Mark, about the energy, the climate crisis, the energy transitions that we're going through, but I'll mention something that people don't focus much on, which is military might. So, of course, the European Union is not a military alliance, but our member states, of course, the vast majority of them are members of NATO. And we in the EU decided the past few years that it is imperative for European member states to work together to be able to deploy more together around the world, to be a true security provider to the world, to be able to create the investments to produce the necessary weaponry, and to be able to do so not just in order to help the EU as a EU, to also have a strong military capacity, but also to be able to support NATO much more effectively. What people don't know is that I don't have a Greek army on the one hand and a Greek NATO army on the other hand. It's one army. Now, keep in mind that European member states spend more on defense today than everyone else in the world other than the United States. but that spending is in many areas very inefficient. We have 17 different tanks and armored vehicles, battle tanks. How does that make sense? It is a total waste of money. And this is why, although we are extreme military spenders, we cannot claim that we have the unified efficiency and capacity to be, the most efficient military users in the world today. But this, as European Union now, we're trying to fix. And finally, in this military capacity, let me remind our audience that for the first time in history, when Putin invaded Ukraine, the European Union itself released 2.5 billion euros to support our member states in giving Ukraine lethal weapons. This is something that has never happened before. So you're seeing a Europe that is not just a values leader in the world because of our creation. It is not just an economic superpower that together with the United States creates prosperity that is unprecedented on both sides of the Atlantic and the world, but it is also becoming a military force collectively to reckon with in support of NATO as well, especially as we are facing now the new major security challenges such as Russia.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Now I know why the EU got the Nobel Prize, which I was quite frankly surprised until I read about it. But what's also fascinating to me is now we're moving from the political description, as you pointed out at the start, to the economic challenges. And if we look at the economic challenges, we've had Larry Summers on the show twice. And quite fascinating background, because I actually, his mother was my economics teacher, but all I know is you need a two-handed economist. On the one hand, this is what Harry Truman said, on the other hand, that. So I don't want to put you in that situation, but we have a mess. There is a global fight against raging inflation. My son and daughter-in-law want to buy a house. Inflation, as you know, this morning is now 6%, twice what it was before. The EU came up with the bank, the ECB came up with a historic 75 basis point rise in interest rates. And given the differences, as I understand it, between Germany and others, this was a unanimous decision. Central banks of both sides are doing their best to fight inflation. What more can be done? How do we balance the fear of inflation against a potential recession with hiked rates? And that's why I mentioned Harry Truman, that I can associate more than with Larry Summers. And that is, say, do we need a two-handed economist, or do you have any words of wisdom on the challenges that the EU faces on those two issues?
Well, I'm a little chastened to offer this crowd words of wisdom on the economy. I would be much better positions to receive them. But I'll tell you on your question a couple of things, Mark. So both the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank, as you correctly mentioned, are taking very aggressive action to bring inflation back down to target. And the point is that no one should doubt the commitment of restoring price stability. They have the tools to do so. They have the will to do so, and they are moving to do so. And I have to say, I am quite impressed by the credibility that I see those institutions enjoying in the markets and the general public. Bond yields are rising, and most important in my view, the expectations of future inflation are very well anchored today. That means that everyone understands that the European Central Bank will do everything necessary and in its power to make sure that inflation soon begins coming down. Now, that said, I don't want to minimize the primary drivers of this inflation spike that we're seeing, both in the U.S. and certainly in the EU. And one of them, of course, is the extremely high energy prices caused by well, we already had a supply issue with energy before, and higher prices, but the energy shock has been exacerbated by Russia's war in Ukraine, and also, of course, supply chain disruptions that came from COVID and are still persisting in many instances. So That's there. Having said that, central banks have a very important role to play in keeping the expectations of future inflation embedded in our economies. And this, I think, is very important. And of course, their actions themselves are bound to reduce inflation, and they will, but they cannot do it alone. And this is where I think that other types of policies have a very important role to play. Yesterday, the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, announced a number of policies that we're putting in place in Europe in order to combat high energy prices. And it goes without saying that if those succeed, I believe that they will, you will see very quickly those prices going down. And because our own electricity, European common electricity energy market ties the price of electricity to the price of gas, it goes without saying that electricity also will come down. The hit to us is much bigger than the hit to you. Our own gas prices have gone up by 10%, by 10 times since the invasion began. I mean, just think of that number, because I know the discussions here about the price of the gas pump, 10 times higher electricity costs today in Europe, and yet we are combating it. Then I would say, in addition to this, in the case of Europe, we have established what we call the Next Generation EU Fund, or the Recovery and Resilience Facility more broadly, in the context of COVID. That will pump in the European economy in the next immediate year and two, close to 700 billion more euros. 100 billion out of the close to 800 billion have already been pumped in. 700 billion still is out there. And these are investments that go to transform the European economy to an economy that is fit to address the climate challenges, while boosting innovation and turning into the 21st century economy and making us leaders in the world as other countries are trying to transition, and also a tech economy and a tech infrastructure. There are additional, like you have your CHIPS Act here, we have close to 50 billion euros that we'll be investing in our own CHIPS Act back in Europe as well. Those kinds of investments will help, offices, vehicles, create efficient, energy efficient homes, create a revolution of renewable energy in Europe and around the world, and frankly also help eliminate a dependence on Russian oil and gas. So it's economic and it's geostrategic, and it matters. And then finally, if I may say, we are conserving, and that also will bring down the high energy prices and inflation, supporting the ECB in its work. This is something that is of huge importance. It's been discussed for a very long time, way before the Russian invasion. The importance of turning a light off in a living room if we're not there anymore, the importance of making sure our offices are not lit all the time or our buildings all the time unnecessarily. People do not understand very often how a simple switch off of the light on their side, and by millions and millions of others, reduces the need for energy consumption dramatically. Dramatically. I mentioned buildings in the EU. Do you know that about 30% of carbon emissions in the EU alone comes out of buildings? Because they're not correctly fitted to deal with, the changes in weather, because of energy inefficiency and waste. Now, as we retrofit these buildings in Europe, including with the funds that I mentioned, not only will we be boosting the economy, but also we will be giving millions of jobs to people. Because to retrofit a building, it's not a matter of just some central banker wiring money to some other central banker. It is hundreds of thousands, millions of workers in any particular town or city in Europe being in those buildings and doing the job. So people have to understand that going and transitioning to green is not a kumbaya thing to do. It is absolutely necessary, but at the same time, a huge boost to the economy. So yes, inflation is a major topic. I'm not underplaying it in the least. We are going to have a tough winter in Europe, but we're not just politically committed to sustain it. We're also putting all the policies in place, including huge incentives to our own industry to be able to address it.
I was recently in a forum where we had two senators discuss energy and its impact on Europe. One was a senator from the great state of Maine. The other was a senator from the great state of Alaska. And the senator from Maine said, wait a minute, we can't export LNG to Europe. What about us? And the senator from Alaska said, well, we can do both. And part of our efforts, obviously, are to point out that you can do both.
Yes.
Now, one of the fascinating issues, and the European Union has taken a leadership role on that, is ESG. And as you know, that gets back to the fundamental question of stakeholder versus shareholder. The reality is businesses need to address ESG. There are some problems between the principles and the outcomes and whatever. But what I'm intrigued with, the EU has been a leader in advancing the International Sustainability Standards Board, ISSB. Do you see any organization developing that can help standardize ESG principles globally? And I might also add, if I could, I don't know if you read the Gillian Tett's pieces in the Financial Times. If you don't, she's just the best. But I'm very intrigued because American companies that I talked to are saying we can address it here, but what about the world elsewhere? So that's an open-ended question, Mr. Ambassador.
So it's a great question, and I appreciate it. We are already talking to our American colleagues to make sure that that the requirements that we have and the standards that we put in place for ESG are as aligned as possible. Because of course, given the huge interoperability of our two markets, it's important for our companies to also have the feeling of consistency and security as they plan the new investments. But of course, we are focused on the international standard setting as well. We believe that if Americans and Europeans can be on a similar page, it's much easier for us to be able to promote those joint standards globally as well against other countries that don't particularly care about including the social elements and the governance elements, of course, of their companies, not to mention the environmental elements. So this is, in fact, it brings me to sort of the first principles. It is not an option for us to be able to deal with the climate consequences of what we do, and they're not the only ones that ESG looks at, but it is not an option. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change recently, as you know, came out with a report, a very, very detailed scientific report indicating that we are really running out of time. And we have committed, certainly we in Europe, to a 55% reduction of emissions by 2030 to carbon neutrality by 2050. And this is because we have to protect our home. We have to protect our home. It is not a matter of choice or option. And the question is, how do you do this in a way that ensures that companies can profit from it as well? Let me give you an example. In Europe, we need about 350 billion of investments every year to cover energy-related projects. And we need about another 130 billion of investments to cover and to finance other environmental objectives. Just think of the opportunities there. This is something that the European governments cannot finance alone, and they shouldn't. These are huge opportunities, profitable opportunities for companies, but they need to know what the rules of the game are. They need to know what is a sustainable investment and what is not a sustainable investment. They need to be able to have financial institutions to offer those kinds of incentives. In many ways, when I was doing human rights, I was talking about the whole topic of business and human rights, as you know, and the UN's, the Ruggie principles and all those things that are out there since 2011 or so. And I was talking to different funds, and pension funds were telling me that we are taking all this into account when we make our decisions. Because frankly, for a pension fund, it's not the profit tomorrow that makes sense, it's the profit 30 years down the line that makes sense. So they fully understood the importance of being able to, to invest responsibly. And they also understood why this would be not just stable, but profitable for their people. Other funds who were much more focused on the short term were much less interested in that discussion. Now, we in Europe already have in place mandatory requirements for funds and financial advisors to disclose how sustainable risks are taken into account. And I know that then the US, the Securities and Exchange Commission, has made a proposal, a similar proposal. As I told you, we're talking together to see how we can align those things. So I am confident that this is the route to go to ensure that companies in the future, the investments necessary for the future, will be supremely profitable and have the stability and the certainty to invest to be so.
I get.
Let me just say, Mark, just last thing on this. You know, back in the European Parliament, back in 2008, 2009, I was one of these crazy members of the European Parliament. There weren't many of us at the time who began the discussion about internet privacy and the importance of that. And there were so many companies, including mostly US companies at the time, that would come to talk to me and tell me that A, this would be a killer for innovation and we shouldn't be doing it. And B, they were telling me, and what's your big deal, by the way? I mean, you know, governments are trying to, you know, catch terrorists and all that stuff. You have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear. So why are you making such a big fuss about privacy? I find that interesting because frankly, if you have nothing to hide, you don't have a life. You know, go get a life, really. You know, we all have, you know, hundreds of perfectly legitimate legal things that we don't want the world to just know, whether it's governments or big companies or corporations or frankly, hackers who are increasingly trying to get all our private information. Well, a few years later, all these companies are competing with each other in the open market to attract customers on the basis of who better protects privacy among them. So there has been a paradigm shift there. And I believe the same thing will happen now with ESG.
This is all fascinating and very compelling. Would you consider becoming chairman of the U.S. Securities Exchange Commission?
I hope no, thank you is not an offensive answer for anyone. But I'm having enough difficulty where I am right now, Mark. But thanks.
Actually, there's a guy named Arthur Levitt who was head of the SEC for many, many years, and he was one of the founders of our organization. Are you all at all concerned about the transition? In other words, right now, the current economic and geopolitical turmoil, perhaps derailing ESG and net zero climate objectives? Do fossil fuels, perhaps with carbon capture and storage, play a role? As you know, the French are lucky that for 45% of their energy now they're looking at nuclear and other, but the transition is, I guess, that concerns me.
Yeah, well, I mean, the transition is important, and we are fully recognizing it. So if you look at the at what we issued recently, our taxonomy standards, so what kind of investments can be considered to be sustainable, you will see that LNG, under conditions, of course, of being a transitional fuel to carbon neutrality, and forms of advanced new nuclear reactors as well under conditions are covered under that, right? But of course, the major emphasis is placed on in Europe on the on a homegrown energy, which is renewable energy. Americans maybe don't know that Europeans, as opposed to the US, actually do not have fossil fuels. So we have very few of them. If we are going to be energy independent, including from Russia, but also if we're going to be kickstarting our economy in the next decades, and also if we're going to be ensuring that the world moves away from fossil fuels, then we have to have a homegrown energy, and that is renewables. And that's where we are investing massively for years now in our member states. And our member states are leaders in virtually every one of these technologies, and it's supremely important that American companies and European companies can work together in joint investments. Europeans investing in this country as well as they have already, but even more massively to support the US transition as well, together with American companies and vice versa. I think that there we have a unique opportunity for cooperation. There's also competition, of course. Companies compete with each other, but at the end of the day, the effectiveness of the green transition on both sides of the Atlantic will depend on having the cheapest, best technologies and products out there, and certainly make sure that we are cheaper and better than China. I have to say two things about this. The first thing is we are very focused on China's unfair competition, in addition to, of course, the systemic rivalry we have with China on the basis of its governance and human rights and values. But the unfair competition is a very big deal for us. So I would say there that one thing Americans and Europeans have to understand, and I think we're doing so increasingly, is that in addition to taking whatever measures we can to protect ourselves against that unfair competition, the most important thing we have to do is to run faster than China, okay? And we didn't spend enough time thinking about that in the past few years, in my view. We have to run faster. You can sit back and whine about the Belt and Road Initiative and blah, 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 and this and that and the other, and what the Chinese are doing and subsidizing and all that. And that's all fair and good. But at the end of the day, unless we invest massively in your own economy, in your own, green technology, in your own tech and chips and all those things, your whining is going to be just basically irrelevant. So the first thing, and I'm very pleased to say that in Europe, we have focused on that a lot. Our CHIPS Act is an example, but our fundamentally, what I mentioned before, the next generation EU investments in tech and all that stuff is there. But the second point I want to make there is that Americans and Europeans need to work together much more closely, and I believe you will see this very soon being announced even, on global infrastructure. Okay, so listen, our companies are losing massively around the world because they do not see as profitable a number of investments where the Chinese are going with very low, subsidized money, sometimes debt traps, all those things, corruption, to take them over. But when we need rare earth minerals, when we need ports, when we need all those things for the global economy to grow fairly, it is not possible to be sitting back and saying, well, okay, we throw our hands up. Have we identified those 50 or 60 investments around the world that are of critical importance and that cannot be lost together? Have we set up the financial mechanisms and incentives to ensure that our companies can bid competitively against others who are not competitive, and to get those and many other projects? Well, this is something that President von der Leyen again yesterday announced. She will be announcing something jointly with President Biden and the G7 in the near future. So you will see much more coordination there. This is something that is very important for our companies and our competitiveness, but we also have to get out of our complacency sometimes. Maybe you make enough money and all that stuff and you're okay, you don't want to risk a little bit around the world. Well, others are out there doing it. And you know what? Here's the key thing. In our containers, when we export things, we don't just put the goods in those containers, we also put our values. You can't see the values, but they're in there. We're not producing Americans and Europeans by destroying the environment. We produce more expensively, therefore, but that's a value. We do not produce by using slave labor or forced labor or anything else. That makes it more expensive, perhaps, but that's our values. Every good in those containers comes out of a free market competition that allows the best to grow, not out of a big government footprint that decides who is going to be the best and subsidize them to death. That is our values. And as our values go in our containers, increasingly the values of other countries, including China, are going in their containers. And they're spreading around the world, whether in Africa or Latin America or elsewhere. And that is creating dangerous situations of corruption, of misgovernment, of all those things that we, in theory, are trying to fight. And world markets will not be as receptive to our products if they get corrupted by that kind of a value system that accompanies goods or bridges being built and stuff like that. This is a big deal. And now that Americans and Europeans understand this, I am much more hopeful for the future, including the future of other countries around the world. Green investment, everyone will need to make it. If we are the first movers, Europeans we certainly are. Americans, if you join us, and you're joining already in many instances, then we also will be able to support countries around the world with our technology as they're making this transition. And this is important geostrategically as well. Mark? Europe has decoupled, is decoupling as we speak, dramatically from its dependence on Russian gas and oil. We're putting a ban on virtually all of Russian oil by the end of this year. And we are down from 40% imports of Russian gas to 9% imports in the past 6 months, because we're importing much more from the United States. US exports last year to Europe of LNG were 30% of the total exports. Today, they're 60%. We're deeply grateful for that cooperation. But at the same time, both of us have to understand that if markets around the world remain dependent on fossil fuels, if you are unable to get to the economies of scale of the green technologies to supply other countries and decouple them from that, the geostrategic challenge of an aggressor like Russia will be forever present. And so it's geostrategically important, not just simply economically important, to move down that path.
Well, I remember actually talking to a CEO of an LNG company who explained to me when they did their LNG platform, it was to import LNG, and then they had to switch it so it became an exporter. But it sounds like you're more than an ambassador. It sounds from the EU. It sounds like you're an ambassador from the entrepreneurship of Silicon Valley.
Well, we just opened an office in Silicon Valley. I'll let you know. Just on the 1st of September, our first office, my embassy's office outside of Washington D.C., is in San Francisco today, precisely because we see a remarkable amount of opportunity to think about the future of tech together, work on the necessary regulations in a way that can, set a world standard, not just of quality goods, but also quality regulations that ensure that our democratic values, and frankly, not the world's democratic values, are protected while having the highest quality, cheapest, best products around for the 21st century. And this is, and you're absolutely right, I want to create that kind of cooperation between us. And in the world, I want to create a level playing field where our companies can compete, on that level playing field, not being undermined by huge subsidies by others, or by huge insecurity and wars and everything else that are created by countries who have nothing to offer in this debate other than instability to make themselves relevant. And I think that's important. When I look at the war in Ukraine, Mark, let me just tell you something I think is also important, because I have mentioned in what I told you the rest of the world. Listen, we very often focus on the countries that are committed politically or ideologically in killing the multilateral system, killing the United Nations Charter, or rewriting it in their own revisionist vision. And that's the right thing to do. And we also focus very often on the like-minded countries, those who want to preserve that international order, want to preserve as best as possible international cooperation. It hasn't been perfect. We haven't been perfect in it over the decades, but it's the best model we have to deal with the major world challenges and to make sure that we lift everyone, right? Poorer countries, most of all, the G77, everyone else. It's not just us and our prosperity that we're talking about, it's the world's, and we should care. And in the war in Ukraine, I've seen Russia go around with misinformation campaigns around the world about how, if you can believe it, that the food insecurity that is hitting the world, and that Europeans and Americans are working so hard with hard cash investments, helping other countries around the world to transition to food security so they don't need us or anyone else. They are self-sufficient. That Russians going around saying all this was caused by the sanctions that were placed on Russia, not by the fact that Russia invaded Ukraine, the breadbasket of the world, not by the fact that they blocked its ports and the Black Sea more broadly, and people could not export that grain, not by the fact that they deliberately targeted tractors and silos and grain silos and everything else, but somehow by the sanctions against them, which, mind you, exclude explicitly agricultural products. What a lie. And yet there are countries around the world that were listening and were talking to us. And we're wondering. And of course, we told them, you give us a single example where you have a problem with food insecurity because of some sanctions, stopping someone bringing something to you will fix it immediately. But of course, very few have come with examples like that because the real problem is the war. But that is out there. So when I tell people very often, yes, of course, this is a battle between democracy and a committed autocrat. But it is much more than that. For me, for us, it is not the West fighting against Russia. It is the West and the East, the North and the South, fighting in favor of Ukraine, fighting in favor of the UN Charter that does not allow any bully around the world to use their power to invade at will any of the neighbors they don't like, let alone any of the neighbors they openly claim they want to wipe off the map. And that is something that resonates with people in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, anywhere else. This is the North and the South, the East and the West, to preserve those principles that we all built together. And they have helped the world in the past 70 years imperfectly, yes, but have helped it not experience the tragedy and the brutality and the evil we are seeing today. So we have to adjust the rhetoric when we talk to countries around the world, and it's very important that we do so immediately.
Mr. Ambassador, I'm very cognizant of the time, but perhaps I can conclude with the following. I'm torn because I've decided you should not be our SEC commissioner, but darn it, your entrepreneurship, your commitment, your passion, I think you ought to run for president of the United States. So that's issue one. Issue two, I'm so impressed. I think you may know that I was born in Vienna. I have my grandfather's Polish passport. I was part of the economic transition team in Bulgaria, but more importantly, I ran the Athens Marathon. So I may really have to become a European citizen after all of this. So I'll be in touch with you about that. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I really appreciate, especially with all the demands on your time. I'm very, very grateful, and thank you for all you're doing and have said.
Thank you. Bye-bye to all. Bye-bye.